One fella said to his son says, I'm going off farming, Dad. He said, well, what's up with farming? He says, is it hard? No, he says, it's not hard. He says, it's too often. Ah.
But I think Britain's beautiful, lovely places. Whichever country you go to, there's beauty. Don't you think so?
Oh, yes, I do.
Lovely. Whichever part of England you go, or Great Britain is a lovely country. A tour from Liverpool. We took the train to London, and coming back it was midnight, and it was many years ago. They were all going to the theatres with the toppers on and the ladies in the evening gowns. It was lovely. And then we went had supper at Lyons Corner House, and it was lovely seeing all the different personalities. And one old lady with us, our first day in London, and looking round, and there she was singing and looking at everybody. She really enjoyed it, having steak and chips at 12 o'clock at night. Oh, we did enjoy it.
Our first images of the country and the city are simple, powerful, and conventional. We have ideas of what a typical city is, what typical country is. We have much less clear ideas about how city and country relate to each other. Just consider these two apparently opposite images, a peaceful cornfield and Hogarth's Gin Lane. But then consider this observation.
The distilling of corn is one of the most essential things to support the landed interest.
This, from the review of 1713, reveals how the existence of Gin Lane was, in a way, only made possible by the overproduction of the corn used to make the gin. Just one example of the often complex interconnection between the country and the city, which this film is trying to explore. Of course, the way we first understand this is affected by personal experience. I wrote about it here on the edge of Wales and England in my first novel. For Matthew, it was a difficult journey coming back from London to this country in which he'd been brought up. In the bus, he had known so few people that he felt like a stranger, empty and tired, until the familiar shape of the valley and the mountains had held and replaced him. It was one thing to carry its image in his mind, as he did everywhere, never a day passing but he closed his eyes and saw it again, his only landscape. But it was different to stand and look at the reality. It was not less beautiful. Every detail of the land came up with its old excitement. But it was not still as the image had been. It was no longer a landscape or a view, but a valley that people were using. He realized as he watched what had happened in going away. The valley as landscape had been taken, but its work forgotten. Far away, closing his eyes, he had been seeing this valley, but as a visitor sees it, as the guidebooks see it, this valley in which he'd lived half his life. When I was writing that passage in my novel Border Country, I was thinking of this place, and coming back from a city, seeing this country in which I'd grown up, I was trying to make a contrast between two ways of seeing the same place. For instance, when I was a child, we just called this place the Tump. Only later did I discover that it's thought to be a prehistoric burial mound. What looks across the valley like a simple grassy bank is in fact an early 19th century tram road built to carry the coal from the mining valleys of South Wales, which were then opening up, to the English cities where it could be sold. Just over that hill, 120 years ago, was the largest iron and steel making centre in the world, Merthyr Tydfil, now in its turn mostly closed, abandoned. And what came from Merthyr passed through this valley, this working country, and helped to change it. What's called the new road across the valley is now in its turn being overtaken by a newer road with straighter stretches for the lorries to run on. The railway that was built in the middle of the 19th century, again to connect the mining valleys with the Midlands industrial cities. In fact, my father worked on the railway in this signal box. All the time, what is moving through the valley is determined by a history that has happened elsewhere. And the country and the city are, in that sense, interconnected from the beginning. You can't really see one as separate from the other. I made my own journey from the country to one kind of city, Cambridge. What I found was a more general view of the city and the country in English history and especially English literature. One standard theme in this writing is the contrast between the city and the country as distinct ways of life. But the interesting thing is that the contrast can be put either way round. On the one hand, the city as modern, enlightened, illuminated, sophisticated, and the country, by comparison, as rather backward, rather simple, rather out of date. On the other hand, that contrast is sometimes turned right the other way. The city is the place of senseless overcrowding, noise, luxury, pride, power, whereas the country, by comparison, is a place of simple innocence, peace, the old values, as it's often put. Or again, what you find in the writing is this sense of looking back to something valuable that has just disappeared.
Sweet Auburn, loveliest village of the plain, where health and plenty cheered the labouring swain, where smiling spring its earliest visit paid, and parting summer's lingering blooms delayed. Sweet smiling village, loveliest of the lawn, thy sports are fled, and all thy charms withdrawn. Amidst thy bowers the tyrant's hand is seen, and a desolation saddens all thy green. No cheerful murmurs fluctuate in the gale, no busy steps the grass-grown footway tread, but all the bloomy flush of life is fled, all but yon widowed solitary thing that feebly bends beside the plashy spring. Here, as I take my solitary rounds amidst thy tangling walks and ruined grounds, and many a year elapsed, return to view where once the cottage stood, the hawthorn grew. Ye friends to truth, ye statesmen who survey the rich man's joys increase, the poor's decay, 'tis yours to judge how wide the limits stand between a splendid and a happy land.
This is from Oliver Goldsmith's famous poem, The Deserted Village. Written 200 years ago, it still stands for one important contemporary way of seeing change.
E'en now the devastation is begun, and half the business of destruction done. E'en now, methinks, as pondering here I stand, I see the rural virtues leave the land.
Nature's disappearing. The world we take for granted soon no more.
In the old days, you can sit on the front door with a stool, and there's always somebody came and talked to you going along, you know, even if there's only old jug in your hand, and they came along and talked to you. They're more happier. The people is more happy in the old days than they are today. But in your house, all right, you've got hot water and everything in, you've got central heating, but flats, no, now it's your own front door. There's all houses, streets, terraced houses, those. I bet most of the people like to get out of these if they got a chance.
Nostalgic feelings about the past are common, not only in individual memories, but increasingly on television. In literature, it's striking how many different writers have looked back to the good old days, which, interestingly, always seem to be just disappearing within their own lifetime.
The well-known contemporary poet John Betjeman looked back in 1966 and said goodbye to hedges and roads with grassy edges and winding country lanes. Looking back to the 30s, perhaps? In 1932, according to F.R. Leavis, an organic Old England had already disappeared in a recent change. And he was echoing George Sturt, who in 1911 observed that rural England was dying out, compared to the genuine thing of 50 years earlier. But go back 50 years, and there we find George Eliot complaining that due to the growth of the new industrial towns, leisure is gone. Gone where? In the period to which he looked back, the Labourer poet John Clare was objecting to the acts of enclosure of hitherto common land, which had left the poor a slave. And in 1769, a few years before John Clare was born, we find the familiar voice of Goldsmith again, lamenting the once sweet but now deserted village.
And so one can trace a continual pattern of retrospective regret, going right back to the Golden Age, or to that perhaps most potent of all idealized places, the Garden of Eden.
And God said, Behold, I have given you every herb bearing seed, which is upon the face of all the earth, and every tree, in which is the fruit of a tree yielding seed. To you it shall be for meat. And to every beast of the earth, and to every fowl of the air, and to everything that creepeth upon the earth, wherein there is life, I have given every green herb for meat. And it was so. And God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good.
From the 16th century, a new kind of poem began to be written, which found this lost Eden in the greenhouses and parklands of the English country house.
The early cherry with the later plum, fig, grape, and quince, each in his time doth come. The blushing apricot, the woolly peach, hang on thy walls that every child may reach.
This is produce seen not as something worked for, but yielding of itself. Not only fruit, but idealized animals in idealized landscapes offered themselves to be eaten.
To crown my open table doth provide the purpled pheasant with the speckled side. The painted partridge lies in every field, and for thy mess is willing to be killed. The pheasant, partridge, and the lark flew to thy house as to the ark, and every beast did thither bring himself to be an offering.
As so often, in an abundant and apparently natural rural order, the experience of the laborers who actually tend the animals or work the fields is ignored.
Difficulty in this district, you see, because it's so steep, as you can see. It's much easier on the flat. It doesn't make us our living, doesn't the view? It's lovely to see, we know, but we don't appreciate the view to what you'll appreciate it. It's an open air life, that's all the difference there is. But it's a very hard life, and you have to really be bred and born to the country life. How would you like to be a farmer?
All this experience of what it's like to produce food was forgotten in favor of the pleasure of consuming it. The laborers were only mentioned when they came together for the annual feast laid on by the lord of the manor. This so-called act of charity was seen for what it was by an early 18th century poet, Stephen Duck. But then Stephen Duck was a laborer.
Our master, joyful at the pleasing sight, invites us all to feast with him at night. A table plentifully spread we find, and jugs of humming ale to cheer the mind, which he, too generous, pushes round so fast, we think no toils to come, nor mind the past. But the next morning soon reveals the cheat, when the same toils we must again repeat, to the same barns must back again return, to labour there for room for next year's corn. Thus, as the year's revolving course goes round, no respite from our labour can be found. Like Sisyphus, Our work is never done. Continually rolls back the restless stone.
This is Tatton Park, an almost perfect model of the way in which the English country house has influenced, indeed dominated, some of our most familiar images of the country.
The little straggling town faded away into country on one side, close to the entrance lodge of a great park, where lived my Lord and Lady Cumnor, the Earl and the Countess, as they were always called by the inhabitants of the town.
The town was Knutsford, where lived the novelist Elizabeth Gaskell. In her novel Wives and Daughters, the nervous heroine Molly is taken on a visit to what is clearly Tatton Park at the height of its prosperity in the middle of the 19th century.
Where a very pretty amount of feudal feeling still lingered and showed itself in a number of simple ways, droll enough to look back upon, but serious matters of importance at the time. The simple worship of the townspeople was accepted by the Earl and Countess as a right. But, yielded all that obeisance, they did a good deal for the town, and were generally condescending, and often thoughtful and kind in their treatment of their vassals. There was a day of honour set apart every summer, when, with much gracious and stately hospitality, Lady Cumnor and her daughters received all the school visitors at the Towers. It was very awful, as Molly thought, and she half wished herself at home again. But she lost all consciousness of herself by and by, when the party strolled out into the beautiful grounds, the like of which she had never even imagined. Green velvet lawns, bathed in sunshine, stretched away on every side into the finely wooded park. She felt better in the fresh air, and unobserved and at liberty, went from one lovely spot to another, now in the open park, now in some shut-in flower garden, where the song of the birds and the drip of the central fountain were the only sounds.
Country houses then as now can appear overwhelming because they're clearly so out of scale with what we know any one family could achieve on their own. What is called today a national heritage is often, as here, the product of generations of unacknowledged lives, given to the creation of the lifestyle of one acknowledged family.
Oh, it's very interesting. Yeah.
Mm.
Well, I like historical,
Yes.
places in history. I like to
Yes.
know the history of the place.
Tatton's history begins away from the present house, near the earlier Old Hall, now being renovated. It's around here that we can see how actual changes took place in the use of this typical piece of English land. Down here by the stream in the 7th century, there was a Saxon settlement, a clearing in the woods. You can still just see the corrugated marks and long strips of the old cultivated open fields, where for 1,000 years or more, 20 families lived and worked the land. This map of 1733 shows in detail the pattern of fields after the great changes brought about by the beginnings of capitalist farming. The village was still there, but the land was divided up and let to a few tenant farmers, rent being paid to an absentee landlord. But later in the 18th century, even these fields disappeared as a result of even bigger changes that took place after the Edgerton family, the absentee landlords, came back to live at Tatton. Building and extending the new house through successive stages caused a chronic shortage of money, and it might well have been abandoned. But at a crucial moment, the family was rescued by an enormous inherited fortune. Samuel Edgerton, painted here in Venice where he'd been sent to learn about buying and selling paintings, was the man who inherited the fortune. From, in fact, his uncle, Samuel Hill of Shenstone, who had died childless after making an enormous amount of money from speculative, probably colonial trade. With this money, made in the city, the family were able to transform the country. They steadily dispossessed their tenants, until by the end of the 18th century, what had been for 1,000 years an English village became a mere corner of their park, a deserted village such as Goldsmith had described.
The man of wealth and pride takes up a space that many poor supplied. Space for his lake, his park's extended bounds, space for his horses, equipage, and hounds.
An inherited fortune may seem at first sight an accident, but there was really nothing accidental about the system that now dominated English city and country alike. There were conscious links between marriages and estates, and these became the subject of many novels, plays, and pictures. And a letter from Samuel Hill about the younger Egertons saying,
They had rather have an estate come by marriage and a settlement than to be at the pains to get one.
A marriage was a business deal, seen sentimentally in this painting at Tatton, but satirically by Hogarth.
The Earl of Squanderfield has to arrange a marriage deal for his son because he needs both to pay off a mortgage for his country estate and complete the building of his Palladian town mansion. Through the window, the city lawyer marvels at its extravagance.
Country and city were not separate, but parts of an interacting system dominated by a single class, who were even able to benefit from later changes which they'd done little to promote. For instance, Ordsall Hall was just another medieval house and estate casually inherited by Samuel Egerton from his uncle. The family never lived there. It was let out to tenants and occupied by both a farmer and an early mill owner. This gives us a clue to its strategic position, bang in the middle of the 19th century cotton manufacturing development of Salford and South Manchester. Owning this property, the family at Tatton now had a stake as ground landlords in a developing industrial city. The Manchester docks are not here by accident. They're fed directly by the Manchester Ship Canal, running back through Cheshire to the sea. By the end of the 19th century, it's no surprise to find that Lord Egerton, a country gentleman, is the chairman of the Manchester Ship Canal Company. The silver spade, which dug the first trench, hangs on the wall at Tatton next to an impressionistic painting of the canal's construction, where the men who actually did the digging are hardly seen. Again, the country and the city are parts of a single story, which, however, still has a few chapters to run. The last of the family spent much of his time travelling through the British Empire, bringing his trophies back for systematic display in the house, which, when he died, he asked to be returned to public ownership. Tatton is now a fascinating place which is deliberately being opened up to reveal its own history. It also now provides the setting for the annual county show, where an urban holiday crowd, surrounded by the exhibits of multinational corporations, attends to watch versions of old country pursuits.
I was brought up with horses in the first place. Happiest days of my life with horses. Technology, it's all right, but eventually it'll die out. Go back to horses. And fertilisers has had its day. Cattle manure is coming back again instead of the fertiliser.
Calm, I love coming here and see all the ponies and traps. Oh, and it's so relaxing to look at. It was beautiful. And yet you get in a line of cars, and the frustration that you feel is Oh, no. We can do without at any time.
But if you don't get any cooperative sheep, you'll not have a good run. Don't matter how good you are. And they're very uncooperative. As our reporter says in the Farmer's Guardian, he says the disputing authority. And they are, you know, always going off to the right.
Of all the kinds of common country life, methinks a shepherd's life is most content. His state is quiet peace, devoid of strife. His thoughts are pure from all impure intent. He bears no malice in his harmless heart. Malicious meaning hath in him no part. He is not troubled with the afflicted mind. His cares are only over silly sheep.
This simplified, romantic vision of an idealized rural existence has been known for thousands of years as pastoral, finding expression in poetry, painting, and porcelain figures. In 1783, the convention was questioned by the English poet George Crabbe.
But when, amid such pleasing scenes, I trace the poor laborious natives of the place, then shall I dare these real ills to hide in tinsel trappings of poetic pride.
Pastoral had become not only an artifice, but a game. A serious religious game, as when the figure of the shepherd was merged with the figure of Christ. More often, a trivial and then resented game of aristocratic make-believe, which had nothing to do with the actual experience of rural labor.
Oft may you see him, when he tends the sheep, his winter charge, beneath the hillock weep. Oft hear him murmur to the winds that blow o'er his white locks and bury them in snow.
Finally beaten by the clock.
The sheepdog trial with working shepherd turned performer is a modern form of pastoral. And this setting, which may look like natural country, was in fact consciously landscaped in the 18th century to make Tatton appear an exclusive kind of place.
The first essential of greatness in a place is the appearance of united and uninterrupted property. And it is in vain that this is studied within the park, if it is too visibly contradicted on the outside.
These opinions and paintings of Tatton are by the landscape gardener Humphrey Repton, who in 30 years, between 1788 and 1818, gave advice in words and pictures on how and why they should redesign their estates to 220 clients all over England.
In Knutsford, the proportion of interest belonging to the adjoining great family should impress the mind of a sense of its influence. By taking down a few miserable cottages and rebuilding them as tenements in a plain, uniform manner, the end of the street will be opened to show the entrance of the park by a simple, handsome arch.
To let people know that they were getting near Tatton Park, Repton even suggested milestones with the Egerton family crest along roads leading up to the house. This was quite probably the basis for the landscape gardener Montague milestone, parodied in Peacock's satirical novel Headlong Hall.
I perceive, said Mr. Milestone, after they had walked a few paces, these grounds have never been touched by the finger of taste. The place is quite a wilderness, said Squire Headlong. My dear sir, said Mr. Milestone, accord me your permission to wave the wand of enchantment over your grounds. The rocks shall be blown up, the trees shall be cut down, the wilderness and all its goats shall vanish like mist. It was reserved for the exclusive genius of the present times to invent the noble art of picturesque gardening, which has given, as it were, a new tint to the complexion of nature and a new outline to the physiognomy of the universe. Give me leave, said Sir Patrick O'Prism, to take an exception to that same. Your system of levelling and trimming and clipping and docking and clumping and polishing and cropping and shaving destroys all the beautiful intricacies of natural luxuriance and all the graduated harmonies of light and shade melting into one another. I never saw one of your improved places, as you call them, which are nothing but big bowling greens, like sheets of green paper, with a parcel of round clumps scattered over them, like so many spots of ink, flicked at random out of a pen, the solitary animal here and there, looking as if it were lost.
Humphrey Repton's ideas were parodied by Thomas Peacock, but taken seriously by characters in Jane Austen's Mansfield Park.
Mr. Rushworth began again. Smith's place is the admiration of all the country, and it was a mere nothing before Repton took it in hand. I think I shall have Repton. His terms are 5 guineas a day. Well, and if they were 10, cried Mrs. Norris, I'm sure you need not regard it. If I were you, I should not think of the expense. I would have everything done in the best style and made as nice as possible.
So the self-conscious observer becomes also the self-conscious consumer of whole landscapes modelled often on paintings, pleasing prospects, which for Jane Austen takes on 2 meanings. In one sense, good material chances in the world. In another, framed views, which have been ordered, created, and paid for. In history, there are periods of rural and social change. In literature, there are different and selective ways of responding to these changes. Here in Farnham, only 10 miles away from where Jane Austen lived, the radical writer William Cobbett, almost her contemporary, was seeing the same country life quite differently.
Born in a farmhouse, bred up at the plough-tail with a smock frock on my back, taking great delight in all the pursuits of farmers, liking their society, and having amongst them my most esteemed friends, it is natural that I should feel, and I do feel, uncommonly anxious to prevent, as far as I am able, that total ruin which now menaces them. But the labourer, was I to have no feeling for him? Was he not my countryman too? And was I not to feel indignation against those farmers who had had the hard-heartedness to put the bell round his neck, and thus wantonly insult and degrade the class to whose toils they owed their own ease?
Where Jane Austen had analysed with great shrewdness conflicts within a single class, Cobbett analysed the conflicts between different classes with a directness which, if celebrated now, at the time landed him in jail.
What is to be the end of this? What can be the end of it but dreadful convulsion? What other can be produced by a system which allows the felon better food, better clothing, and better lodging than the honest labourer?
Meanwhile, a few miles away in Selborne, another writer, the Reverend Gilbert White, had been looking not at social life at all, but at the physical facts of his surroundings, looking out from a hide he built under the tree at the bottom of his garden, observing natural history directly and classifying it, a third way of seeing.
Last June, I sent you a list of the summer birds of passage which I've observed in this neighbourhood. Birds that cease to be in full song and are usually silent at or before midsummer. Birds that sing for a short time and very early in the spring. Birds that sing as they fly are but few.
Gilbert White's intense interest in nature was detached and scientific. A much more involved and all-embracing vision of nature was expressed by William Wordsworth, particularly in a poem written in July 1798, looking down from this vantage point in the Wye Valley, 3 miles from Tintern Abbey.
Once again do I behold these steep and lofty cliffs that on a wild, secluded scene impress thoughts of more deep seclusion and connect the landscape with the quiet of the sky. These beauteous forms, through a long absence, have not been to me as is a landscape to a blind man's eye, but oft in lonely rooms, and mid the din of towns and cities, I have owed to them in hours of weariness sensations sweet, felt in the blood, and felt along the heart. And so I dare to hope, though changed no doubt from what I was when first I came among these hills, when like a roe I bounded o'er the mountains by the sides of the deep rivers and the lonely streams wherever nature led, more like a man flying from something that he dreads than one who sought the thing he loved. I cannot paint what then I was. The sounding cataract haunted me like a passion, The tall rock, the mountain, and the deep and gloomy wood, their colours and their forms were then to me an appetite, a feeling and a love that had no need of a remoter charm. For I have learned to look on nature, not as in the hour of thoughtless youth, but hearing oftentimes the still, sad music of humanity. And I have felt a presence that disturbs me with the joy of elevated thoughts, a sense sublime of something far more deeply interfused, whose dwelling is the light of setting suns and the round ocean and the living air and the blue sky, and in the mind of man, a motion and a spirit that impels all thinking things, all objects of all thought, and rolls through all things.
Because we're interested in Wordsworth and the lake poets and all this part of the country. I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on higher vales and hills, but all once I saw a cloud, a host of folded daffodils.
Oh, because Wordsworth lived here, and, you know, we're thrilled with Wordsworth since we were a little child. You know, since I was a little child, I've always read his poetry, and someday thought, you know, never really thought as a child that I would ever be here, truthfully. But now we're here, and we're very thrilled with the thought that this beautiful poetry that we've always read, and here's the man who, you know, had lived here, the man who wrote this poetry.
In the early 19th century, Wordsworth's feeling for the wild landscape of places like Kirkstone Pass was unusual, even derided. It's now very general.
Within the mind, strong fancies work, a deep delight the bosom thrills, oft as I pass along the fork of these fraternal hills, where, save the rugged road, we find no appanage of humankind. Who comes not hither ne'er shall know how beautiful the world below.
What's perhaps most remarkable is that when he came to the city and encountered London for the first time, he saw it in several ways, each of which we can still recognize as familiar.
Earth has not anything to show more fair. Dull would he be of soul who could pass by a sight so touching in its majesty. This city now doth like a garment wear the beauty of the morning. Silent, bare, ships, towers, domes, theatres, and temples lie open unto the field and to the sky, all bright and glittering in the smokeless air.
This is the ordinary attitude of wonder and awe, the city abstracted as buildings seen from a distance. But going further into the city, Wordsworth looked upon the living scene.
The vast metropolis, fount of my country's destiny and the world's, that great emporium.
This is a new way of seeing men and women in what is experienced as a new kind of society and new kinds of physical relationships.
Endless stream of men and moving things, the quick dance of colours, lights and forms, the deafening din, the comers and the goers face to face, face after face. How often in the overflowing streets have I gone forwards with the crowd and said unto myself, the face of every one that passes by me is a mystery. Thus have I looked, nor ceased to look, oppressed by thoughts of what and whither, when and how, until the shapes before my eyes became a second sight procession, such as glides over still mountains or appears in dreams.
In 1844, a German, Friedrich Engels, came to the English city. Experiencing the same feelings, he drew different conclusions.
And still they crowd by one another as though they had nothing in common, nothing to do with one another. And their only agreement is the tacit one, that each keep to his own side of the pavement, so as not to delay the opposing streams of the crowd. And however much one may be aware that this isolation of the individual, this narrow self-seeking, is a fundamental principle of our society everywhere, it is nowhere so shamelessly barefaced as just here in the crowding of the great city.
Engels went to Manchester and immediately tried to grasp its overall structure, how each part related to the other.
The town itself is peculiarly built. so that someone can live in it for years, travel into it and out of it daily without ever coming into contact with a working-class quarter, or even with workers. I have never come across so systematic a seclusion of the working class from the main streets as in Manchester. I have never elsewhere seen a concealment of such fine sensibility of everything that might offend the eyes and nerves of the middle classes.
But Engels went into the back streets to see for himself the conditions of the poor.
The background is formed by old factory buildings which resemble barracks. And such a district exists in the very centre of the second city of England, the most important factory town in the world.
And this district was still then owned by a family 20 miles away at Tatton. It was the poorest part, around Ordsall Hall in Salford.
It was here that I found a man who appeared to be about 60 years of age, living in a cowshed. He had constructed a sort of chimney for his square-shaped pen, which had no flooring, no plaster on the walls, and no windows. He had brought in a bed, and here he lived, although the rain came through the miserable, ruined roof. The man was too old and too weak for regular work, and sustained himself by removing dung, etc., with his handcart. Puddles of excrement lay close about his stable.
Engels, making connections, seeing both the details and the whole, wrote one of the first and most brilliant expressions of what would later be called the sociological view of the city. Cities were now becoming so complex that different ways of understanding, classifying, finding out who and how many lived where and in what conditions became necessary. A statistical way of seeing people that would create, for instance, social services in place of random charity and different kinds of political awareness. New responses were called for in fiction and provided mainly through the novels of Dickens, who went north from London to experience a new kind of city built around new kinds of work.
Coketown, to which Messrs. Bounderby and Gradgrind now walked, was a triumph of fact. It was a town of red brick, or of brick that would have been red if the smoke and ashes had allowed it. But as matters stood, it was a town of unnatural red and black, like the painted face of a savage. It was a town of machinery and tall chimneys, out of which interminable serpents of smoke trailed themselves for ever and ever, and never got uncoiled. It had a black canal in it, and vast piles of building full of windows, where there was a rattling and a trembling all day long, and where the piston of the steam engine worked monotonously up and down, like the head of an elephant in a state of melancholy madness. It contained several large streets, all very like one another, and many small streets, still more like one another, inhabited by people equally like one another, who all went in and out at the same hours, with the same sound upon the same pavements, to do the same work, and to whom every day was the same as yesterday and tomorrow, and every year the counterpart of the last and the next.
It's a vivid, if oversimplified, description of a newly imposed industrial uniformity. Dickens could never see London in this way. Its life and history were too complex. Between 1700 and 1820, the population had risen to well over 1 million, and for a long time it had been almost 20 times bigger than any other city in England. 18th century London was the astonishing creation of an agrarian and mercantile capitalism. Georgian London grew up alongside the less welcome but inevitable labyrinths of the poor, who came in large numbers from the country to the city to service the huge variety of small industries and endless different kinds of trade. The country was transformed to supply the city, and by 1851, England's urban population exceeded its rural population, a crucial turning point in human history. Now people, if they wished, need never leave the city, with its varied and hectic bustle, It could be experienced not just as a part of life, but as life itself.
I've never lived in the country. I've always been a town bird. It's where your living is, where your livelihood is, where everything goes on. Soho, to me, is an example to the rest of the world. It's where you've got at least 30 or 40 different nationals living together in perfect harmony. You name it, it's in Soho. I mean, if you want something, you're able to get it in Soho, handmade.
The toil and labour of writing without that magic lantern, London, is immense. My figures seem disposed to stagnate without crowds about them.
Dickens, writing home from Italy, hankered after London. His way of seeing grew out of the coincidences and chance encounters of the street. But within the chaos, he also recognized the local communities, then resisting 19th century railways, as they now do 20th century motorways.
Stagg's Gardens was regarded by its population as a sacred grove, not to be withered by railroads. The first shock of a great earthquake had just at that period rent the whole neighborhood to its center. Traces of its course were visible on every side. Houses were knocked down, streets broken through and stopped, deep pits and trenches dug in the ground, enormous heaps of earth and clay thrown up, buildings that were undermined and shaking, cropped by great beams of wood. Here, a chaos of carts, overthrown and jumbled together, lay topsy-turvy at the bottom of a steep, unnatural hill. There, confused treasures of iron, soaked and rusted in something that had accidentally become a pond. Everywhere were bridges that led nowhere, thoroughfares that were wholly impassable, temporary wooden houses and enclosures in the most unlikely situations, carcasses of ragged tenements and fragments of unfinished walls and arches and piles of scaffolding and wildernesses of bricks and giant forms of cranes and tripods straddling above nothing. Hot springs and fiery eruptions lent their contributions of confusion to the scene and wholly changed the law and custom of the neighborhood. In short, the yet unfinished and unopened railway was in progress, and from the very core of all this dire disorder trailed smoothly away upon its mighty course of civilization and improvement.
With brilliant insight, Dickens saw both the negative and positive aspects of this massive transformation in the pattern of people's lives.
To and from the heart of this great change, all day and night, throbbing currents rushed and returned, incessantly, like its life's blood. Crowds of people and mountains of goods departing and arriving scores upon scores of times in every 24 hours produced a fermentation in the place that was always in action.
Now the city never sleeps. For some, this became its glamour. For others, its nightmare.
What saw I in the city, which could make all thought a frenzy and all feeling madness? What found I in the city, for whose sake blank death were welcome as a restful gladness? What found I? Dead stone sentries, stony-eyed, erect, steel-sworded, brass defended all, guarding the sombrous gateway deep and wide, hewn like a cavern through the mighty wall. Stone statues all throughout the streets and squares, grouped as in social converse or alone. The vigorous heart and brain and blood and breath, stark, strangled, coffined in eternal stone.
This is the vision of the poet James Thomson, who died tragically in 1882, an alcoholic vagrant.
The city is of night, but not of sleep. Their sweet sleep is not for the weary brain. The pitiless hours like years and ages creep, and night seems termless hell. This dreadful strain of thought and consciousness which never ceases, or which some moment stupor but increases, this, worse than woe, makes wretches there insane. Although lamps burn along the silent streets, even when moonlight silvers empty squares. The dark holds countless lanes and close retreats, but when the night its fearless mantle wears, the open spaces yawn with gloom abysmal. The sombre mansions loom immense and dismal. The lanes are black as subterranean lairs.
In this vision, the city became the physical embodiment of an anguished modern consciousness, traceable directly in 20th century writers like T.S. Eliot.
Under the brown fog of a winter dawn, a crowd flowed over London Bridge. So many, I had not thought death had undone so many. Sighs, short and infrequent, were exhaled, and each man fixed his eyes before his feet, flowed up the hill and down King William Street, to where St. Mary Woolnoth kept the hours with a dead sound on the final stroke of 9.
Feeling the weight and stress of life in the city, thousands turned to new kinds of places that were neither country nor city, but suburban.
'Tis pleasant through the loopholes of retreat to peep at such a world, to see the stir of the great Babel and not feel the crowd, to hear the roar she sends through all her gates at a safe distance, where the dying sound falls a soft murmur on the uninjured ear. Good God, how sweet are all things here. How beautiful the fields appear. How cleanly do we feed and lie. Lord, what good hours do we keep. How quietly we sleep. What peace, what unanimity.
I belong to London.
London, the city of laughter and tears, bright lights and gay nights. Dinner at the Ritz or a sandwich on the Embankment, it's all the same. Rich or poor, all help to make London a city with a big heart. And Big Ben is the...
Music Hall dramatized a potent, if sentimental, vision of belonging to the city.
belongs to them.
But simultaneously with the legend of the Londoner, there grew up the twin legends of the West End and the East End. The one smart, wealthy, cultured and sophisticated. The other dark, mysterious, violent, poor. Both in their own ways glamorous and cosmopolitan, and particularly fertile environments for a new form of popular fiction, the detective story.
My dear doctor, this is a time for observation, not for talk. We are spies in an enemy's country. Let me see, said Holmes, standing at the corner and glancing along the line. I should just like to remember the order of the houses here. It is a hobby of mine to have an exact knowledge of London.
The private eye could see right through the complex fabric of the city while remaining detached, an apolitical, mythic figure like the Londoner. But in fact, just then, London, especially the East End, was the scene of new forms of political conflict. Cities gave new possibilities for mass political demonstrations, of which Matthew Arnold, among others, in principle disapproved.
Monster processions in the streets and forcible eruptions in the parks, even in professed support of this good design, ought to be unflinchingly forbidden and repressed.
These riots of 1866 were needed to gain a right we all now take for granted, one man, one vote. But as so often when individuals act collectively, they can be seen from the outside as a mass, and then as a mass they become the victims of a generalized hostility. Industrial society has provided many opportunities for seeing other people as masses. Historically, mass demonstrations are challenges to the system which is determining urban life. It's the poorer, underdeveloped areas of the world which contribute to the lifestyles of the rich, advanced industrial states, which are now even called metropolitan, where before the word metropolis simply distinguished city from country within one nation-state. And the city became a popular way of referring to the 1 square mile center of this network of world trade.
With a modern building like this, advantage has been taken to install the most up-to-date communication system, linking the trading floor with the members' offices and the investing public.
In this way of seeing, the world is abstracted into 5 major centers from which international banking, insurance, and the multinational corporations extend their influence. And part of this influence has been to make many different kinds of city across the world all look like the same city. Everyone was led to imagine that the future would be more of the same. Towering cities completely cut off from the land. Food for these cities produced elsewhere, appearing almost as magically as in the country house poems.
And every beast did thither bring himself to be an offering. The blushing apricot, the woolly peach, hang on thy walls that every child may reach.
Today, the country makes a reappearance inside the life of our cities, but transformed into images, ideas of the natural, used by advertisers to sell what are often manufactured and processed products. Remote rural areas, which are often losing their population and livelihoods, become the dream places of urban escape. The country house becomes a backdrop for a lifestyle. Houses with gardens make way for flats without. All that is left in the precinct on the ground is the nostalgia associated with a name. The village community projected to sell beer inside anonymous urban environments. Of course, most of the inhabitants of this imaginary village will not be rural workers at all, but commuters from the city. Meanwhile, city institutions are putting our savings into a new phase of capitalist agriculture. The countryside itself, often to be enjoyed as landscape, is never only that. It's always, first of all, land that has to be worked. We may be able now to enjoy the gardens and parks of country houses, but we mustn't see them nostalgically. They were built as exclusive places, only recently made available for us to visit.
Love to keep them going, yes. Well, you might be just as happy in a cottage. A lovely cottage. Yes. You have somebody nice to live with.
Meanwhile, our real needs have to be met where we actually live. What's interesting now is that within the cities, much of the conflict is about what kind of city people want. In London, for instance, the struggle can take the form of trying to make an actual garden in the area of Covent Garden, in opposition to the speculative multi-story office blocks. In the East End, attempts are being made to redeem the now empty spaces of dockland for allotments and an urban farm. A balance between country and city, felt as a human need opposed by dominant and often destructive financial priorities. Just 2 examples of trying to get for real what advertising only wants you to dream. Those with money can, of course, find their own solutions, their own balance. But what really matters for most people is the general problem. Back in the valley where I grew up, many of the children were probably like me, leave it to find work elsewhere. In the deprived inner cities, children can grow up not only never experiencing the country, but completely cut off from the ground. This ultimate split between the city and the country must now be repaired. Much of our future depends on the struggle to develop new relations between them. We have to decipher all the images that surround the country and the city, and to understand the real contradictions and connections between them.